Some weddings begin with music and flowers, but some begin with silence. The kind of silence that hides pain, secrets, and truths waiting to explode. This is not a story about love alone. This is a story about dignity, about a mother's instincts, and about what happens when arrogance meets truth. If you have ever felt humiliated, judged, or underestimated, then listen carefully, because this story might sound painfully familiar. That night, I learned something painful and unforgettable. I learned that a wedding, which is supposed to unite hearts, can also expose lies that destroy entire families. My name is Margaret Lewis. I am 57 years old, a widow, and a mother of 2 sons. This story is about my eldest son, Ethan. The day of his wedding should have been the proudest moment of my life. The day I watched my son step into a future filled with love. Instead, it became the day I finally found the courage to speak a truth that had been burning inside me for months. The church was glowing with warm golden lights. White roses lined the aisle, and soft music floated through the air as guests smiled and whispered with excitement. Ethan stood at the altar in a charcoal gray suit, adjusting his cuffs again and again, trying to calm his nerves. I could see it in his eyes, that mixture of fear and hope. He had worked so hard to reach this moment. No shortcuts, no inherited wealth, no powerful family name. Just honesty, discipline, and kindness. I raised him that way, and I was proud of the man he had become. Then Clara walked in. She was beautiful, elegant, and trembling slightly as she held her bouquet. When she looked at Ethan, her face softened, and I knew she loved him. But behind her, sitting in the front row with a confident posture and a practiced smile, was her father, Richard Hawthorne, a wealthy businessman. A man whose name opened doors, a man people respected without asking questions. From the moment I saw him, my chest felt tight, because I already knew the truth he had spent years hiding. The ceremony itself was perfect. Vows were exchanged, tears were wiped away, and applause filled the church. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that love had won, that maybe, just maybe, the past didn't matter anymore. But then came the reception, and with it, the moment that changed everything. Richard Hawthorne stood up to give a toast. He held his glass confidently, his voice deep and steady as he smiled at the crowd. He spoke about his daughter, calling her ambitious and strong-willed. People laughed politely. Then he paused and turned his gaze toward my son. He said Clara had chosen love over logic, and that sometimes emotions lead us to make risky decisions. He said he hoped Ethan would someday prove he could give his daughter the life she deserved. Laughter spread across the room. Not loud, not cruel, but enough to humiliate a man on the most important day of his life. I watched my son's smile fade. His shoulders stiffened. His eyes dropped to the floor. And in that moment, something inside me shattered. Because I knew Richard Hawthorne was not the man he pretended to be. And I knew that silence would make me just as guilty as his lies. But this story did not begin at the wedding. It began 6 months earlier, the day Ethan sat across from me at our small kitchen table and told me he had met someone special. He smiled like a shy boy again and said her name was Clara. He spoke about her kindness, her intelligence, and how she believed in him, even when the world didn't. Then he mentioned her father, Richard Hawthorne, and I felt something shift inside me. That name carried weight, and not the good kind. When I finally met Clara, I understood why Ethan loved her. She was gentle, respectful, and warm, but every time her father was mentioned, her voice changed. She said he believed money equaled worth, and that sentence stayed with me long after she left. The first time Ethan met Richard Hawthorne, he came home quiet. He told me Richard had questioned his salary, his savings, his future. He said Richard had smiled and told him love was nice, but stability was better. That night, I couldn't sleep. Weeks later, by pure coincidence, I saw Richard Hawthorne in a cafe across town. He was not alone. He was with another woman, and two small children ran toward him, calling him Dad. The way he held them, the way the woman kissed him, told me everything I needed to know. He was married, respected, admired, and living a second life in plain sight. I didn't confront him. I investigated. I hired a private investigator, not out of revenge, but out of fear for my son. And what I discovered was worse than I imagined. Richard Hawthorne had another family, 2 children, a woman who believed he would one day leave his wife, and that wasn't all. He was using company money to support that secret life. Loans, tax evasion, fraud. The empire people admired was already collapsing from the inside. I kept the truth to myself, because my son was in love, and love deserves a chance. But I made myself a promise. If that man ever humiliated my son again, I would not stay silent. And then came the wedding, and the toast, and the laughter. When Richard Hawthorne finished speaking, I stood up. The room went quiet. Every eye turned toward me as I walked slowly to the microphone. Richard looked confused, then irritated, forcing a polite smile as he asked if I wanted to add something. I said yes, I did. I told the room I raised my son alone after his father died. I told them I worked multiple jobs and taught him honesty, loyalty, and dignity. I turned to Richard and said privilege without integrity is empty. I asked the room, how many of them truly knew the man standing before them? I spoke about the apartment on Maple Street, the woman waiting there, the children who called him father. Phones were recording. Whispers became chaos. Richard Hawthorne collapsed into his chair, exposed and powerless. I turned to Clara and told her she deserved truth, not illusions. Then I looked at my son and told him he was enough, that he always had been. That wedding didn't end a marriage. It ended a lie. Months later, Richard Hawthorne was under investigation. His company fell. His reputation vanished. Healing and independence. And my son stood taller than I had ever seen him before. Because dignity doesn't come from money, it comes from truth. And if there's one lesson I want you to remember, it is this: never measure your worth by someone else's arrogance. Never let silence protect cruelty. And never underestimate the power of truth spoken at the right moment.